When a head of state's basic status becomes a documented topic at a congressional intelligence hearing, that's a meaningfully different category of uncertainty than ordinary political rumor. There's a detail in Wikipedia's own info box for Mojtaba Khamenei worth noting almost for its own sake because of how much it captures about his public image during this exact period. Alongside his formal titles, the entry lists his nicknames as Phantom of Tehran and Shadow Prince, names that reflect exactly the kind of absent, half-glimpsed leadership this entire account has been documenting, rather than any nickname his own government would have chosen to promote. Even before this specific war, according to that same entry, Mojtaba had spent years building influence quietly, running his father's sprawling office and its network of contacts, while cultivating close ties to the Revolutionary Guards, rather than occupying any high-visibility public role of his own. That background may explain part of why his sudden elevation to supreme leader, followed immediately by his near-total disappearance from public view, felt so consistent with how he'd operated his entire career. A figure built for influence from the shadows, thrust into a role that traditionally demands exactly the opposite. When Mojtaba did break his silence, it was specifically to promise retaliation, not to reassure his own public about his health or his plans. According to a headline referenced directly in Outlook India's own reporting, Mojtaba Khamenei said the US and Israel will pay for the assassination of Ali Larijani, the senior official killed in March, adding, "Every drop of blood has its due." That's a notable choice of first major public statement for a leader whose most basic condition, alive or dead, injured or recovered, was still being actively debated inside America's own intelligence community at the time he made it. The Israeli side of this had made its intentions toward Iran's leadership explicit well before any of this specific confusion set in. And this is where the second half of this story's framing actually comes from. According to reporting from The Express, after killing Ali Khamenei, the IDF posted directly on X in Farsi. After neutralizing the tyrant Khamenei, the terrorist regime of Iran is attempting to rebuild itself and select a new leader. We want to tell you that the hand of the State of Israel will continue to pursue every successor and every person who seeks to appoint a successor. That is Israel's own military, in its own stated words, committing publicly to treat the entire concept of Iranian succession as a target list, rather than a domestic political process it would simply observe from the outside. Whatever Israel prepares to strike Tehran means, as a general description of this war's trajectory, that IDF statement is about as close to an official, on-the-record confirmation of that exact intention as this conflict has produced. By May, the leadership uncertainty had widened into something closer to an open, ongoing crisis rather than a temporary post-strike mystery. According to Wikipedia's own dedicated entry on the resulting leadership crisis, since the assassination of Ali Khamenei and the broader wave of American and Israeli strikes, Iran has faced what that entry calls an unprecedented succession crisis, driven specifically by the sudden death of more than 40 Iranian officials in the war's opening strikes, with an interim leadership council reportedly formed and a further formal succession process still to be determined at the time that entry was last updated. Look at how the government actually tried to fill that vacuum administratively, because it tells you something about how seriously Iran's own institutions treated the scale of the problem. According to Wikipedia's own entry on the leadership crisis, an interim leadership council was formed in the immediate aftermath of the strikes that killed Ali Khamenei and dozens of other senior officials, with a further, more permanent succession election still to be determined at the time that entry was last updated. Setting up an interim council, rather than simply sliding one designated successor into place immediately, is itself a signal that Iran's own government recognized this wasn't a normal, orderly transition. It was crisis management, built to hold the structure together while a more permanent answer got worked out over time, precisely because more than 40 of the people who might ordinarily have been part of that process were already dead. That instability is the exact backdrop against which the specific warning at the center of this entire story was actually made. According to Fox News' own reporting, published on May 11th, a regional analyst warned that Iran regime insiders may flee to Russia after high-stakes negotiations with the United States collapsed and cracks within the country's military leadership continue to deepen. The analyst quoted directly, Saeed Golkar, drew an explicit comparison to Bashar al-Assad's own flight from Syria, telling Fox News that for the most senior Iranian figures, Russia would probably be the most likely destination, again as we saw with Bashar al-Assad. That comparison carries real weight specifically because it's recent, real history, not a hypothetical scenario invented for this specific warning. Assad, the longtime Syrian president, fled his own collapsing government for exile in Moscow in December of 2024, after Syrian rebel forces swept into Damascus following years of civil war, ending more than 5 decades of his family's rule over the country. Russia had backed Assad's government militarily for over a decade, intervening directly in the Syrian civil war, specifically to prop up his position. And it was that same relationship, cultivated over years, that gave Assad an actual place to land the moment his own government collapsed, rather than leaving him with no options at all. Golkar's warning is built directly on the observation that Iran's own decades-long alliance with Russia could function the exact same way for Iran's senior leadership if their own government ever reaches a similar breaking point. A real working relationship between two governments, not just a country any fleeing official might pick at random. Golkar's warning is explicitly built on the idea that Iran's own senior leadership, watching that exact precedent play out 18 months earlier, might already be planning their own version of the same exit. Golkar was specific about which figures might take which route, and that specificity is worth preserving exactly as reported rather than flattened into a single vague warning about commanders. According to that same Fox News piece, while top commanders such as Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf might head to Moscow specifically, lower-ranking figures would more likely seek shelter in Iraq or Afghanistan instead, where the IRGC already maintains operational connections and existing infrastructure. Golkar added that many Iranian officials had already moved their personal wealth into what he called financial networks located outside Iran, a detail suggesting the groundwork for a potential departure, regardless of whether that departure actually happens, may already be underway at the level of personal finances, even without any public commitment to actually leave. Before getting to Ghalibaf specifically, it's worth pausing on what several named experts actually think this entire pattern of absence signals about Mojtaba's real authority, because their assessments go beyond simple health speculation. According to the Times of Israel's own reporting, Alex Vitanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, wrote that Mojtaba Khamenei cannot summon Khomeini's charisma, and he cannot fake his father's authority, which took a lifetime of crises to build, predicting instead that Mojtaba will most likely rule through the institutions, rather than over them, a meaningfully weaker form of power than his father ever held. A separate expert cited in that same reporting, identified only as Sabet, put it even more bluntly: for most Iranians, Mojtaba will likely have even less legitimacy than his father and appear weaker. Professor Ali Ansari of St. Andrews University, cited in Outlook India's own reporting, framed the structural problem in even starker terms. How do you have a charismatic succession when the successor isn't there? It's going to be a problem for them, even if they ride it out for the time being. It's not sustainable in the long run. 3 separate named academics, across 2 separate outlets, converging on the same basic conclusion. Whatever authority Mojtaba technically holds by title, his prolonged invisibility is actively corroding the kind of personal legitimacy that role has traditionally depended on inside Iran. That same Times of Israel reporting also offers a detail explaining exactly why hereditary succession itself carries special political risk in Iran, beyond the specific question of any one leader's health. According to that reporting, Iranian authorities are acutely aware that hereditary succession was precisely what the Islamic Revolution rejected when it overthrew the Shah's monarchy back in 1979, meaning a father-to-son transition of the supreme leader's own office. However it actually happened administratively, sits in obvious tension with the founding ideology of the government now carrying it out. That's not a minor footnote. It's a structural vulnerability baked into the very succession this entire story is about, independent of anything to do with Mojtaba's physical condition specifically. Naming Ghalibaf specifically matters here, for a reason that goes beyond his formal title. According to the Times of Israel's own reporting on Mojtaba Khamenei's continued absence, Ghalibaf wasn't just any parliamentary speaker. He was also serving as Iran's chief negotiator in talks with the United States, and he was present at Ali Khamenei's funeral ceremonies in July, standing among what that reporting called a who's who of key remaining figures in the Islamic Republic. A man holding both the country's top legislative position and its lead negotiating role with Washington is exactly the kind of senior figure whose potential departure would carry outsized weight. Not a low-level defector, but someone sitting at the actual table where this war's diplomatic resolution, if there is one, would have to be negotiated. Think about what it would actually mean, practically, for a figure in exactly that dual position to leave the country rather than see this through. Every round of talks this war has produced, from the earlier constructive sessions in Muscat through the 14-point memorandum eventually signed in Versailles, depended on Iran having someone in the room empowered to speak for the government's actual position, and someone back home with enough standing to make that position stick once the delegation returned. If the person occupying both of those roles at once were to leave for Moscow, the country wouldn't just lose a diplomat, it would lose the specific continuity between whatever gets negotiated at the table and whatever the rest of the Iranian government is actually willing to honor afterward. Exactly the kind of gap that could turn any future agreement as fragile as the ones this war has already produced and already watched collapse. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own framing of what a leadership collapse would mean, cited in that same Fox News reporting, adds real strategic context to why this specific warning matters beyond Iran's own internal politics. Netanyahu said any collapse of Iran's regime would dismantle what he called the scaffolding of the terrorist proxy network Iran had built across the region, saying, "The whole scaffolding of the terrorist proxy network that Iran built collapses if the regime in Iran collapses," and suggesting it could potentially end Hezbollah's influence in the region as a direct consequence. That's Israel's own head of government explicitly tying a potential Iranian regime collapse, the same collapse Golkar's warning is built around, to a much larger regional payoff extending well beyond Iran's own borders. President Trump's own comment on the state of Iran's leadership, cited in that same reporting, adds one more piece to why succession has become such a genuinely open question rather than a settled formality. Trump said U.S. military strikes on Iran had been so effective that they eliminated much of the regime's anticipated leadership succession bench, directly raising the question of who would actually lead the Islamic Republic going forward. When the sitting American president is on record saying the war itself wiped out the normal list of people who would have stepped into power, that's a direct acknowledgement that whatever structure exists to replace a wounded, absent supreme leader is thinner than it would have been before this war started. And yet, for all of that layered uncertainty, Golkar's own conclusion, quoted directly by Fox News, is worth ending on precisely because of how carefully hedged it actually is. Asked directly whether this kind of exodus would actually happen, he said, "I think you can't predict when that will happen." Is it possible? Yes. Is it guaranteed? No. That's the analyst whose own warning this entire story is built around, explicitly declining to convert his own prediction into a certainty. A title that states flatly that commanders are fleeing to Russia is describing something more definite than the single-named source behind that claim was actually willing to commit to himself. Put all of these pieces next to each other and a considerably more nuanced picture forms than a single dramatic headline could carry on its own. Iran's own supreme leader has been wounded, largely absent from public life, and subject to genuine high-level uncertainty about his exact condition, confirmed not by rumor, but by a sitting U.S. Defense Secretary at a Pentagon podium and by questions raised directly at a congressional intelligence hearing. More than 40 Iranian officials died in this war's opening strikes, producing what Iran's own succession structure itself has treated as an unprecedented crisis. Israel's military has stated, in its own words, posted directly in Farsi, that it intends to keep targeting anyone who seeks to fill that leadership vacuum. Against that backdrop, one named credentialed regional analyst has warned with real specificity about which individuals might go where, that senior regime figures could follow Bashar al-Assad's own well-documented path into Russian exile, while explicitly refusing to say that outcome is guaranteed or even predictable in its timing. That's the honest version of this story, not a confirmed flight already underway, and not an imminent, newly announced Israeli operation against the capital, but a genuinely unstable leadership structure. An enemy that has publicly committed to hunting down anyone who tries to stabilize it, and at least one credible analyst willing to put a specific escape route and a specific name on the table as a real possibility rather than a certainty. Every piece of that is independently verifiable through the named sources above, and none of it requires stretching a single one of those sources further than the people actually quoted in them were willing to go themselves. Every part of that is serious enough to warrant close attention on its own. None of it needs to be inflated into something more definite than the people actually making these assessments have been willing to claim themselves. Every claim in this account traces back to a specific named source. Wikipedia's own dedicated entries on Mojtaba Khamenei and the broader 2026 Iranian leadership crisis, including his own listed nicknames, and the formation of the Interim Leadership Council, reporting from the Express on Khamenei's absence from his own succession ceremony, and the IDF's own Farsi language statement threatening to pursue any successor, Yusuf Pezeshkian's own telegram statement, Bloomberg's own video reporting on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Pentagon press conference describing Khamenei as wounded and likely disfigured, Israel Hayam's reporting, citing named American and Israeli security officials on Khamenei's continued isolation, the CIA's effort to verify his telegram photographs, and the questions raised at a House Intelligence Committee hearing, the Times of Israel's own reporting on Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf's dual role and presence at Ali Khamenei's funeral, alongside its cited expert analysis from Alex Vatanka and the analyst identified as Sabit, Outlook India's reporting on Professor Ali Ansari's assessment of the succession problem, and Mojtaba's own public statement vowing revenge for Ali Larijani's death, and Fox News' own May 11th reporting, containing analyst Saeed Golkar's full, directly quoted warning, his specific comparison to Bashar al-Assad, his named prediction about Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf specifically, and his own explicit hedging about whether or when any of it might actually happen. Wherever a claim rested on an analyst's forward-looking prediction, rather than a confirmed, already completed event, that distinction has been preserved here exactly as it was originally reported, rather than converted into something more settled than the source itself ever claimed. There's one more dimension worth adding before closing this out, because it connects this specific leadership crisis to the broader pattern this war has already shown at every other level. Just as the American public record repeatedly separated a confirmed, narrow fact from a more dramatic secondhand claim built on top of it. Throughout this exact war's strikes on islands, bridges, schools, and shipping, the exact same pattern shows up here at the level of a single man's physical condition. What's confirmed? Mujtaba Khamenei was wounded in the strike that killed his father. What's confirmed? He has been largely absent from public life since, missing his own succession ceremony and a holiday address his father delivered every year without exception. What's confirmed? A sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense described him on the record as wounded and likely disfigured, and his condition became serious enough to be raised formally before Congress. What is not confirmed, by any source gathered here, is a final, settled answer to the single question every one of those officials, analysts, and family members has been circling around for months. Whether he is, in any functional sense, actually running the country whose military keeps getting invoked in his name. That unresolved question is precisely why a warning like Golkar's carries as much weight as it does, even hedged the way he himself hedged it. A government whose most senior figure remains this much of an open question, 5 months into a war, is a government where senior commanders weighing their own personal exposure have genuine reason to start planning contingencies, regardless of whether any specific flight to Moscow ever actually happens. The uncertainty itself, not any single confirmed departure, is the real story sitting underneath this entire account. What's actually confirmed, stripped down to only what these named sources will support. Iran's supreme leader was wounded in the strike that killed his father, and has remained largely absent from public life since. A fact serious enough to draw direct comment from the U.S. Secretary of Defense and formal questions before Congress. Israel's own military has publicly committed to targeting any successor who attempts to fill that specific leadership vacuum. And one named regional analyst, citing real financial movements and the recent well-documented precedent of Bashar al-Assad's own flight to Moscow, has warned that senior Iranian commanders may eventually follow the same path, while being explicit that this remains a possibility he's tracking, not a departure he's already confirmed. That's a serious, well-sourced story about genuine instability at the top of a country at war. It just isn't, based on everything gathered here, quite the same story as the one a single dramatic headline would have you believe already happened.